Hello and welcome to the VSC podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma, or those who have experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. My name is Hannah Jennerine, my pronouns are she, her, and I am the violence prevention educator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. In this podcast, we discuss sensitive topics such as violence and sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. For the Florida State Sexual Helpline, call 888-956-7273. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There is always someone ready to help. In this episode, I have with me two amazing individuals, Joseph and Erica, who both work at Florida Legal. They are here to talk about Florida's housing crisis and the impact it has on victims of domestic and sexual violence. They have so much information to share, so please be ready, get your listening ears on, because you're going to enjoy this episode. Joe and Erica, thank you so much for being here today. Can you please share with our listeners more about who you are and what you do within your respective roles at Florida Legal?
Sure, I'll jump in. So my name is Joseph Cordova. I am an attorney at Florida Legal Services. After graduating from the University of Florida Law School, I spent 2 years as an Equal Justice Works Fellow, where I worked with immigrant communities in small rural towns in North Central Florida. And that's where I really started to understand the interacting with the vulnerable populations of immigrant communities, low-income communities. And after that 2 years of the fellowship was complete, I then moved into my current position, which is the project manager of our Fair Housing project. And that is a grant through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, where I'm continuing my work assisting vulnerable populations and communities with accessing legal services that they're desperately in need of.
Thank you, Joe.
And hi, I'm Erica Rechak. I'm the Director of Survivor Advocacy here at Florida Legal Services. This is my 5th year here at this organization, but I have been practicing for 15 years. I've mostly been in the public interest sector, working at different legal aids in Virginia and here in Florida. I graduated from the University of Florida, so I'm a big Gator fan, and in my free time, I do enjoy working. When I'm not working, I enjoy following Gator sports, but here at work, I mainly oversee all of the survivor advocacy work that we do with domestic violence survivors and victims of crime.
Thank you so much, Erica. And as I'm going to continue telling you, thank you both so much for being here today. I appreciate you so much. And to our audience, these two individuals have so much to share, so I promise you're going to learn a lot from this episode. So since we're going to be unpacking the Florida housing crisis and the impact that it has on victims of domestic and sexual violence, I want to start off by asking, can you describe the current state of the housing crisis in Florida?
Sure. So I thought maybe we'd share just a few statistics that we'd been able to gather from just some general information about Florida to kind of give you an overview as to maybe how we've gotten to this point. From the National Low Income Housing Coalition's website, it shows that for Florida, 21% of renter households are extremely low income. In order for a 4-person household to be extremely low income, that household would have to make a maximum income of $26,200. Meanwhile, in $54,870 is the annual household income that's needed to afford a 2-bedroom rental home under HUD's fair market rate. So you already see the disparity in those amounts. Just to start with that, 80% of severe low-income households have a severe cost burden. When I say severe cost burden, poor households, those mean those that are spending more than half of their income on rent. So usually when you're qualifying for a home loan, for example, you shouldn't be using more than 1/3 of your income for housing. But here, just for rental households, you're looking at more than 50% of their income that's being used just to cover the housing expenses. But Joe, if you want to.
Yeah, and then just a few notes kind of behind the statistics. So like there's more than a few factors leading to the current housing crisis, especially here in Florida. The first is that rents are just raising, they're out of control as far as the rapid increase that people are seeing in their rents. So people are finding that at the end of their lease that they signed 10 months ago, when their landlord says, in the next 2 months, we're going to raise the rent when it comes time to renew your lease, they're being told it's going to raise by 300, 500, 700. I think I talked to someone the other day where it raised $1,400. Basically, in order to renew their lease, they were going to have to pay $1,400 a month extra. And if they decide to look elsewhere, or basically what's happening is that they're moving into someone else's home or apartment that also just saw a rent increase and they moved out. So it's kind of like we're moving into each other's apartments, both of which now had raised or increases in rent. And so people are left with nowhere to go. Add to this in the fall here in Florida, especially Gulf Coast, honestly, all through Central Florida, and the entire state gets impacted anytime it's hurricane season. But in Florida this past fall, we had 2 back-to-back hurricanes, and it left a lot of homes in disrepair, and a lot of homes were uninhabitable. What that means is that a lot of people were displaced, and there aren't enough homes available. And so that one more layer of competition was added, and that drives up the price of housing. And then finally, something we deal with every day, there's still just a lot of discrimination and segregation. And so families of color, families with children, immigrants, and people with disabilities are further limited to neighborhoods and communities where they may actually feel welcomed. And so what this is leading to is people are getting evicted at higher rates than ever as they are unable to pay rent and find a place to go. And so having an eviction on one's record, it further limits one's ability to secure new housing. And you can see how this cycle perpetuates and kind of feeds itself as things move forward. And one thing usually leads to a worse thing. And then when you add to it any sort of domestic violence related incident on the property, previous eviction, poor credit, or something more intense that's occurred in your life, you're adding a very serious layer of struggle in the housing crisis. So to compete in the current housing market while at the same time dealing with additional struggles of domestic violence related trauma, financial despair, and emotional stress, it's just often a losing game.
Wow. Thank you so much for that information. What are the unique housing challenges faced by victims of domestic and sexual violence in accessing safe and stable housing in Florida? And how does the housing crisis intensify these challenges? I know that's a loaded question, so take your time.
No problem. First and foremost, domestic violence can take so many different forms. It's not always abuse that will leave a physical mark. Sometimes it is the emotional abuse, the financial abuse, the isolation, the controlling behaviors. And all of these things are certainly going to impact a survivor within that relationship, within their life, and as they take those steps to remove themselves from those situations in the future. When you're working with the survivors, you have to keep in mind that they may have been controlled in every aspect of their lives. They may have been limited in their ability to work outside of the home. They may have had the opportunity to find a job, but because of the controlling behaviors by that individual, constantly calling at work, accusing the person of having an affair with coworkers, the jealousy, all of those behaviors could have risked someone's employment. They may have quit their jobs. They may not be comfortable in having worked and may be in a situation where they don't have any work experience or no outside resources for any finances whatsoever, and are just relying on this individual. So when that survivor is now taking actions, and if they are trying to leave that relationship, if they are trying to seek housing, they're already starting with everything else that they're dealing with those disadvantages of not having, they may not have an adequate credit score. Their credit may have been ruined by that individual that was abusing them financially. They may have had accounts opened in their name. They may have had their name put on accounts where, such as the past housing, and have evictions on their record. So there are a lot of challenges that that person may already be facing just when they're starting to find housing. So the limited finances, the limited resources, overcoming any negative credit history, all of those things are going to be what that survivor faces as they're seeking housing. We are coming at this from the perspective of attorneys too. So whenever I do hear those circumstances from survivors, I definitely try to think of, how can we work around this? We may not be able to change the past, but are there options going forward? But sometimes that survivor doesn't know what options they have when they're first taking those steps to remove themselves from the situation.
Erica, I love that you said that because as the violence prevention educator, I can't tell you how many trainings I've given and how, like, that is a reason why a lot of victims don't leave abusive relationship. It's because of that isolation, it's because of that control. And just from a violence prevention standpoint, abusers, their main goal is power and control. And they want them to be in that sphere of them having all the power and control. So they'll make sure that the victim doesn't have a job. They'll make sure that the victim doesn't have access to a bank account. And these, like Erica said, these are challenges that they face in accessing safe and stable housing. So Erica, thank you so much for that answer. Joe, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Erica pretty much covered it for that one.
Okay. What role do systemic barriers such as poverty, discrimination, and limited affordable housing options play in exacerbating the housing challenges faced by survivors of domestic and sexual violence in Florida?
I mean, I think just as you mentioned about the challenges with leaving and having that power and control by the abuser, I think that by itself is going to place that survivor in a situation of poverty as they're trying to leave. I know that generally, I think the average is 7 times that it takes a survivor to leave. And oftentimes that financial reliance, I mean, if you're a person who is enduring in a situation of domestic violence and you're thinking about your children and thinking about how am I going to feed these kids? Can I afford diapers on my own before I'm even thinking about finding housing, finding the other things that I'm going to have to sacrifice in order to pay for housing? It's all, I know with domestic violence specifically, there are options such as an injunction where if someone is living with their abuser, seeks an injunction, is able to get exclusive use and possession over the residence through an injunction. That doesn't mean that they can afford the rent on their own if they are paying rent or if they're paying the mortgage. So there are going to be other considerations where that in itself may not solve everything at the onset. I know that there are other, the poverty is certainly going to create limitations. And while there are shelters, there are transitional housing programs that may be available. Just as with everything else, it seems in the, our current world, the demand exceeds what's available. So I think it is a circumstance where the financial limitations and the poverty are certainly going to create some barriers in someone leaving that abusive situation, and it is certainly going to be an uphill challenge.
And then regarding discrimination, so we have some dots to connect, but they're easily connected. So statistically speaking, women are at a much greater risk of not only being the victims of domestic violence, but the statistics skew even more towards women when we're adding details such as physical violence and rape. However, when the police get called and the neighbors then complain to the property manager, the entire household gets evicted, which that alone is discrimination. So what this means is that more women survivors are impacted, but still just get discriminated against in the future for having an eviction on their housing record. So this is called disparate impact. Disparate impact is the idea that we have a rule that applies to everyone. So a property manager or landlord might have a rule that says, if you call the police and bring the police into our community, we evict everyone. Or maybe a future landlord has a rule that says, if you have an eviction on your record, I'm not going to rent to you. Okay. But when you play that rule out over time, the rule itself is not discriminatory, but over time, you're going to end up denying more women than men housing because women are going to be the survivors or the victims of these incidents more often than men are. So that's where the discrimination comes into play. It's not necessarily discriminatory treatment. It's a discriminatory impact over time when you implement this rule. And so women survivors will be more likely to be turned away from housing than men. They're more likely to be survivors and carry that eviction record due to the domestic violence they were on the receiving end of. And so the numbers get even more shocking when you account for LGBTQ plus people, immigrants, people with disabilities. The likelihood of being in an abusive relationship for these communities increases greatly. So already being discriminated against just got worse again.
Joe, you actually just led me to my next question. Thank you so much for mentioning the LGBTQ plus community, because these are individuals, especially when it comes to youth as well. They are leaving their houses because of the biases and the stereotypes that are perpetuated against the community. And these are individuals as well who face challenges when it comes to housing. So I'll ask you more about the LGBTQ community in a moment. But when it comes to the immigrant community, immigrant survivors of domestic and sexual violence may be subject to unique forms of abuse. So, for example, abusers may use immigration and legal status to keep them in the cycle of power and control, like I mentioned earlier. What role do immigration policies and the fear of immigration enforcement play in worsening the housing challenges faced by immigrants in Florida?
It's a great question, and that's something that we've been working with for years. So many immigrant families, regardless of how big or small, have at least one member of the family whose status in the United States is either pending or something other than permanent resident or citizen. This means that the entire family lives in the shadows and tries to keep a low profile because they're trying to protect that one family member who is currently adjusting their status to something other than maybe undocumented or an overstay of a visa or something like that. And so families that choose to live in the shadows to protect that one family member, they also choose not to utilize services and resources that may be available to them, but they're nervous about putting themselves out into the community to do such things. That's one of the reasons why you'll see a lot of immigrant families are more reluctant to allow even their school children to participate in after-school activities or Little League sports or something like that, because a lot of these families say, kids, you can go to school and come right back home, but that's kind of the life we have to live. So this often also means not calling the police when domestic violence incidents occurs. So many men and women who are abused simply adapt to these relationships as they fear someone in their home, or even they themselves risk removal from the country entirely simply because they contacted the police for safety and one thing led to another. Similarly, many immigrants are dependent on their spouses for immigration petitions and sponsorships. So say, for example, a US citizen spouse is the petitioner for an immigrant spouse. Well, that US citizen spouse is going to dominate the relationship. They're going to threaten to withdraw their petition and even contact the authorities themselves to seek removal. I know myself, and I'm guessing Erica as well, we've seen many situations where part of the abuse is one spouse constantly telling another spouse, if you don't do what I say, I'm one phone call away from the authorities to have them come get you and remove you. This is extremely fearful and confusing because it's a spouse saying it to another spouse. That's usually not what marriages are built upon. And so in addition to that, while immigration policies allow for certain reliefs, such as U visas and the Violence Against Women Act protections, most survivors are unaware of these options, or they simply don't find a way of connecting to these resources or the advocates that can help them. And furthermore, doing something about the situation often means being homeless in a new country with financial, cultural, and linguistic barriers. So a lot of immigrant survivors simply just put up with it, because when they do the math and they figure out what calling the police looks like, or what seeking safety looks like, short term, it's immediate, homelessness, and where do I take my kids, and what do I do with my life at this point? It's a whole lot easier in their minds to put up with it and hope it gets better. 2, 3, 4 years down the road, it just hasn't gotten any better.
And when we work with survivors, especially of the immigrant community, we try to keep in mind that there may be some cultural issues that we may not be completely educated on or aware of. We try to be as culturally competent as possible, but we do work with a lot of immigrant individuals. Within my team, I'm fortunate that we do have a pretty diverse a group of attorneys. We have an attorney that speaks Haitian Creole. We have an attorney that speaks Portuguese. Most of our attorneys are bilingual. So we try to, really connect and hear the survivors that we're working with and their experiences and where they're coming from. And of course, as Joe mentioned, we have heard very much about the imbalance of powers basically in a relationship, because if one person has status and the other person does not, automatically you're starting off with an uneven playing field. One person is certainly going to exert that power. One person may certainly use, as Joe mentioned, you have to do what I ask. And sometimes those cultural, that background, that culture, sometimes it's not helpful when part of your culture is your family saying, he brought you to the United States, you have to do what they're asking. So you're working with a survivor that may be facing, enduring a very difficult situation, and at the same time facing a lot of pushback from even their own culture and their own families about what is acceptable and what is not. Of course, here we want to make sure that the individuals are seeking the help that they can, but we try as much when we speak to individuals to let them know, what their options are. But their reality is, if law enforcement is contacted, there's already a fear of what's going to happen. And if one of the individuals speaks English and the other person does not, there's a very good chance that the English speaking person is going to get the opportunity to tell their side and their version of the events first. We've certainly spoken to individuals before who have been the one that is actually the one arrested, and charges may ultimately not be carried out. The state may end up dropping them, but initially at the point of evaluating the situation, we certainly have had individuals who identify as a survivor who tell us that is their reality of what took place. We also know that individuals have a fear of just going to the courthouse sometimes, even to file that injunction, because what if by going to the courthouse, then that person ends up encountering law enforcement, having any questions asked about their status. So I think it is certainly something that creates some fear within the immigrant community about reaching out for help. But as Joseph mentioned, we certainly, here, at least through our agency, we can certainly try to offer them guidance, see if they may be eligible for some of that relief that crime victims and survivors of domestic violence may have available to them for immigration purposes.
Thank you, Erica. Speaking about barriers and cultural barriers, and based on your own experience, what barriers would you say exist when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community in housing?
I'll throw this out there. So I'll give you kind of short little examples that I'm starting to see more of in my work. Under the Fair Housing Act in February 2021, sex-based protection, so meaning you can't discriminate against someone for their gender, now includes enforcements for sexual orientation and gender identity. So the law itself, the Fair Housing Act itself did not change, but the enforcement of it now includes sexual orientation and gender identity. This is new, even though it's as of last week, it's 2 years now. It's still relatively new as far as how it's being enforced, awareness of this new enforcement, housing providers' awareness of it, and stuff like that. What that also coincides with is, 2015, Obergefell was the case where same-sex marriage was now recognized throughout the United States. So all of this is relatively new in our history of this country. So when you have a same-sex couple, especially a same-sex marriage, a lot of housing providers are still slow to come around and not recognizing that this is a marriage, that these are two spouses living together. And so the cultural understanding of these aren't roommates, these aren't two people cohabitating. This is a marriage, meaning they're sharing a life, they're sharing bills, they're sharing everything together. You often see housing providers still respond to them as two individual people. You guys work it out amongst yourself, who pays what bill, who pays utilities and stuff like that. There's this mindset of roommates are living in this unit instead of a married couple. This happens especially when you now see domestic violence enter the situation, which is rates of domestic violence in the LGBTQ community are very high. So housing providers are basically responding to it as more of a, well, if we can just get them off the lease, then you'll be fine. you don't just get a spouse off of a lease. We're married. This is a married situation. And so culturally speaking, I think housing providers are having a little bit more of a slower time coming around to the point that this isn't just a matter of let one go and let the other one stay, or just work it out as if these are two individual people. So I don't know what the solution is to that other than time and awareness and just kind of being understanding that this is now how it is. And you can't just apply 20 years ago assumptions to the modern day.
Right. Joe, I know you spoke briefly on hurricanes when it comes to the housing crisis, but how has unforeseen circumstances such as the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as Hurricane Ian that happened just a few months ago, exacerbated the crisis?
Yeah, so I can jump. So we saw that in times of crisis and lockdown, people's living situations, they changed drastically. And so if you're being in an abusive relationship during a worldwide lockdown, or during, hurricane while you're waiting for your place to be repaired or something like that, your ability to escape is minimized, especially if you're living during a lockdown. So living in a home that has experienced damage, or you're being forced to lock down, you don't have any refuge. So if your home, let's say the back bedroom, the windows got knocked out from the hurricane and there's lots of leaks and you just have to close that off. If that used to be your place of refuge, if that used to be your sanctuary for peace, it's no longer available to you. So people are now cramming themselves in their homes even more so, because they're basically saying there's only 3 rooms left in this house that we can live in. So we're going to be around each other more often. And if it's an abusive relationship, not only are you around your abuser more often, you're probably triggering their what causes the abuse, what causes conflict, what causes arguments, and so on and so forth. Especially now in times of increased rentals, hurricanes, we're still coming out of COVID. If someone lost their job and the whole family is being displaced, you're just basically adding layers of stress. And so the intensity of that relationship is increasing as well. So rates of abuse and incidents of DV, they sharpen upwards post-hurricane, post-crisis, during a lockdown and stuff like that.
Yeah, we certainly had concerns. I mean, specifically during COVID, when the world was on lockdown, and knowing that sometimes the only safe time is when the abuser would leave for work. But if no one's going to work, there are financial hardships and, all these aggravating factors that certainly escalate the hostility and the abuse and everything else within the home. I know during COVID, when there were the eviction moratoriums, if someone was trying to leave, they may have a harder time in finding housing, because for a certain period of time, no one was getting evicted. So the regular, turnaround of housing, where someone may move, someone may, move for a job, relocate, for the evictions that were taking place, and then a unit would come available, none of that was happening. So affordable housing really wasn't available during that time. And I certainly think that there was a period where people really had nowhere to go, even if they wanted to. And as Joe said, I think there were just a lot of aggravating factors with the hurricanes, especially if people were now having to go from an apartment to a hotel to stay there temporarily. Now you're living in a much smaller space where, of course, you don't even have an opportunity to walk away or cool off, because you're in one room and sharing that shared space.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. It doesn't take long to realize, well, if we can no longer afford our rent in our 2-bedroom apartment, that means we're affording rent in a 1-bedroom apartment. Well, our family didn't shrink, just the space that we're sharing shrinks. And if you're actually having to, sign 12-month leases, that's stressful to be staring at the beginning of a 12-month period where now the same size family is living in a smaller space. Emotionally, mentally, it's going to be exhausting before you even hit month 2, and you know that there's still 10 more months to go.
What initiatives and programs are currently in place to support survivors of domestic and sexual violence in accessing safe and stable housing? And what more can be done to address their housing needs?
Well, I think that there always could be room for more available, affordable housing. When I'm speaking to a survivor, one of the first questions I ask them when they're having concerns about housing is, what is their housing situation now? Are they living in something a particular housing where they may receive some type of rental assistance, have a voucher, live in subsidized housing, because fortunately for them, there may be other options available. With subsidized housing programs, you may have the option of bifurcating that lease, so you don't necessarily have to choose who may get to maintain the subsidy, or you may not be out of options if you're not the head of household. So we certainly want to make sure we're getting down to the root of that first to see if there may be other options with what you currently have available. But of course, we always refer individuals. The first referral we always make, Florida Legal Services operates across the state of Florida. So we're not just limited to Central Florida. We certainly speak to survivors from, Key West all the way up to Tallahassee and the Panhandle. So the first point of referral is to their local domestic violence center, because they may have other resources besides the shelter that they may offer themselves. They may work with local providers. There may be some local grants or individual agencies that offer some transitional housing for survivors where there may be a greater period of time to stay. I know there are some transitional housing programs that are funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. There might be some relocation assistance that may be available through the Crime Victim Compensation or through the Access program if they're already receiving those benefits. So I think that there are some options. Of course, each county and each different location may be a bit different, but there's always room for more, especially because there has been a decrease in affordable housing for the reasons we noted earlier. But just from our housing work here at Florida Legal Services, I know some of the work that we, evaluated was in looking at some of the Section 515 affordable housing, the rural housing loans that were had been provided and either were maturing or being prepaid, which removes some of the affordable housing from here in Central Florida. So I think there's definitely a shortage. There's definitely always room for more.
Joe, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
The only thing I would add, and Eric touched upon this, so when we talk about protections under the Violence Against Women Act, most of those protections apply to like public housing or subsidized housing. When it comes to private housing, VAWA is still there, but it's just not as strong. It doesn't have as much teeth in private housing. It would be wonderful if the Violence Against Women Act were expanded to include more protections in private housing as far as discrimination against survivors and stuff like that. I know that there's conversations about it happening. It's just a matter of seeing if that trend starts to take action in the place of private housing now includes more protections under VAWA.
Thank you, Joe.
And we certainly look at the fair housing. How Joe and I really started working together here at Florida Legal Services was under our Fair Housing Project and looking at any discriminatory practices, if there were other considerations or protections that survivors, because fair housing can protect you from not just when you're already living in a unit, in an apartment, a rental, purchasing a home. It can be from the moment of application. So when we speak to individuals that are facing that moment where they're applying for housing, even if it's not subsidized or through an affordable housing program, but even when they're working with a private landlord and applying for housing and they're being denied housing due to past domestic violence, that's where we want to get involved and see how we can advise someone further, what options they have, are there protections available for them, because that is our passion and our work here at FLS.
So I did some research and I found that according to the Florida Commission on Human Relations, Floridians are entitled to rent a place to live or buy a home without consideration of their race, color, national origin, sex, handicap, familial status, or religion. So how would you say systemic discrimination, such as housing segregation and redlining, impact the housing opportunities of these protected classes?
Yeah, definitely. So redlining was the idea in the 50s and 60s. It was actually the government doing it, where they would literally draw red lines around certain neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods were predominantly neighborhoods of color. And they would tell banks and government loan programs to say, don't loan to the people living in these neighborhoods. They didn't say don't loan to people if they are people of color. It was don't loan to people who might be looking to buy a home in this neighborhood. What that did was that basically was a government issued segregation. So if you live in this neighborhood or you want to live in this neighborhood, you're not going to be able to get a loan. What this does over time is that if you don't get a loan to buy your home, then that means you're going to have to rent it from the person who already owns it. So you're going to always be a renter and never be an owner occupied resident of your own home. So over the course of 20, 30, 40 years, people who are living in their own homes that they own, they're building equity, and they can pass that equity on to their children and their children's children. And then you get to the present day where white communities are more likely to own their own home, have equity in their homes, and have children that are going to be able to take advantage from that. Whereas in communities of color, you have families that are unable to pass on equity from their homes to the next generation. They're basically passing on a lease. Now you're going to be the tenant and you're going to pay the same landlord. What that does is that fast forward to the modern day, you have more white families with greater prospects of having equity in homes. People of color do not have that same equity. Another indirect consequence to that is that the actual home values in the communities of color don't rise because there's no sales. There's no trend of buying and selling, or buying and rehabilitating and selling again. And so you basically have stagnation in the communities of color and you have progress in the white communities. So today we have these segregated neighborhoods, and you might be able to say, well, we don't have those policies anymore, but we're still living in the aftermath of 60-year-old policies that may be outdated, but we still see them today.
How is Florida Legal addressing the growing need for short-term and long-term housing for people escaping domestic and sexual abuse?
So I don't know if we at Florida Legal Services can necessarily address the housing specific needs for being a housing provider, but what we certainly try to do is we operate the statewide domestic violence legal hotline. So when someone contacts a statewide number and selects the option to speak to a legal advocate, that would be one of our attorneys. So we would certainly try to see what their situation is. Sometimes individuals end up finding themselves in a situation where they're facing eviction due to domestic violence that happened within the unit. I think Joseph touched on this a little bit earlier, where a landlord may not necessarily be fully aware of what's going on. I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt, and they may issue a termination notice due to criminal activity in the unit, but they may not necessarily be aware of the domestic violence that happened. So we want to make sure that we're advising the survivor of their right, that you should not be penalized. You cannot be evicted because of your status as a domestic violence survivor. We've talked earlier about certain rights that apply only when you live in subsidized housing, but that's not one of them. You cannot be evicted because you are a survivor of domestic violence. Calling for help, calling the police because you are in a violent situation should not be a reason that you as a survivor are penalized once again, or you've already endured the domestic violence. This shouldn't be something added onto their plate. So we want to make sure that that's something that is being articulated, if whether it's a communication to the landlord or at least the tenant knowing what they need to file within their responses to the court, the deadlines that they're responding to. Sometimes it's their application. If they're applying, they're saying, I have evictions on my credit, or I had no idea that this person had opened up all these accounts under my name, and now they're saying I'm being rejected due to credit. We can give them information, advice about pulling their credit report, disputing items on their credit reports. So we come at it from the legal advocacy perspective of evaluating if there's any discriminatory practice. Is there any advice we can offer you? Is there something we can do for advocacy for you, or can we refer you to the legal aid in your county that may be able to do that? If there's any discrimination here, we want to know further. And we at Florida Legal Services have different departments, so this may be something that if it's a county that I know Joseph and the team is working on with respect to evaluating any discriminatory practices, I'm going to make sure to get it over there for another screening as well. But I would say any survivor can certainly contact the statewide hotline of 800-500-1119. They can be directed to us. They can also just speak to advocates for resources in their areas as well. I know the main number can certainly speak to them any time of the day, give them any local shelters, any of that information, but we're here for the legal aspect of it and are certainly happy to evaluate further.
And what I really, really love about Florida Legal Services, and Eric touched upon this, is that we operate many different projects. So vulnerable communities can enter many different doors into our organization. And then once we do the intake, we understand what their story is, it's easy for us to internally refer people from project to project so that they're making sure that one person might be facing three issues, or three crises at the same time. Well, we might have three projects that address each one. One of the ones that I work on mostly right now is our fair housing project. That's housing discrimination. And I talked earlier about how women as survivors are very often also victims of housing discrimination, simply because their status as women and status as survivors. What we do at our Fair Housing Act is not only do we help them understand their rights, but if they do have a situation where their landlord terminated their lease, denied them housing or something like that, and it's all because of they were simply the victim of domestic violence, we can help them better assess whether or not the activity that occurred against them crossed the legal line. And if it did, we can recognize that there's an opportunity to file a complaint with HUD that leads to an investigation of the matter and better understanding of the housing provider's policies and practices that might need to change. In addition to working directly with survivors, we actually do a lot of outreach and presentations to communities. So we do our best to show up at advocacy, community events. We give presentations, food drives, we have brochures. And one of the things I'm really proud of is we do a lot of presentations to housing provider groups. So apartment associations, real estate organizations, and we give in the presentation, heads up, this is a violation of law. Or if it's not a direct violation of law, it's probably an indirect violation of law. And 6 months down the road, you might find yourself in a situation where you're turning away more women survivors than men. And that's, again, a violation of disparate impact. So when I have conversations with housing providers, and I have 10, 15, 20 of them in the room from all around the region, a lot of great discussion and conversation comes out of that. You have a lot of housing providers say, I didn't know any of that. We need to change our policies and practices. So if we can head off the discrimination at the source, you're less likely to have someone down the road giving us a phone call saying, I live at, Sunset Apartments and they're discriminating against me, because Sunset Apartments never participated in one of your presentations. So the more we can reach out to the housing providers, the better off we are. And then another door that people can reach us is through our eviction prevention hotline. That's something that we get about 100 to 150 phone calls a week now from our eviction prevention hotline, where people are at risk of eviction. We walk them through the eviction process. But like we mentioned earlier, regardless of why you called, during that conversation, we're going to do our best to pull out any other issues you might be facing. So I get a lot of phone calls from people that are simply saying, I got a 3-day notice from my landlord. What do I do? Well, when we ask follow-up questions and we do a full intake, we realize that the 3-day notice was actually the result of discrimination. And the caller didn't even know it. A lot of people don't know they're facing discrimination in the moment. They only know it later. So the more we can have these conversations now, the more we can do outreach and create awareness, the more people are able to see these red flags sooner rather than later. And so whether you called us because you're seeking assistance for domestic violence or housing discrimination or simple eviction, you've reached an organization that can at least do the full intake and help you become more aware of your rights, help you file complaints, and everything like that. I know that at the end of my conversations, even just on the eviction prevention line, a lot of people will say, knowledge is power. I didn't know any of this until I talked to you, and now I can actually make better decisions. Or I didn't even know my landlord was breaking the law against me in the first place. Now that I do, I can take action.
Wow.
And I think we find ourselves sometimes, the other side, the landlord may be just a private landlord where they're not really in the business of being a landlord. They just happen to have this other rental property. And sometimes they don't know what they don't know. And it's our, part of our job is to educate them and to let them know, hey, was this what you meant? This doesn't seem appropriate according to Florida law. And in our advocacy, we can certainly educate that landlord while providing the services. I know we focused a lot about gender-based discrimination with survivors of domestic violence, but I know another hot topic under fair housing is emotional support animals and if that's related to a disability. And I think, I've been in presentations with Joe and, sometimes people are very shocked to learn still that you can't charge a pet deposit for an emotional support animal. So it's one of those things where, educating the other side, but also educating the survivors we're working with. I know you work with survivors as well, so I'm sure you understand I always refer to it as the onion. There's layers upon layers of, what are the first issues and the first layers that the person is dealing with. And housing may not be the very first one that they're thinking of at the start of all the abuse and everything else, but we want to make sure that we're at least trained to spot those issues when we're asking those questions. And I would echo Joe that one of my favorite things about Florida Legal Services is that if it's something that I've taken to the point that I can take, I know that there may be another department I can refer it to, and we can maybe take it those further steps. So.
And I just want to add, Erica reminded me of something. In fact, Erica is the one that taught me this in the first place a few years ago. That a lot of times, we mentioned earlier when we were talking about the protections under the Violence Against Women Act. Well, a lot of times survivors are now also suffering from PTSD, anxiety attacks, panic attacks, depression. These are diagnosed disabilities, and disability is a protected class under the Fair Housing Act. And without doing that full intake to truly understand what life is like for this person now, they might be missing where other protections exist in their life. Because when you have kind of a narrow vision of this happened to me, what happens now, you don't really get to see the forest for the trees of actually not only did this happen to you, but it resulted in so much more. And there are services available for that so much more, or there are protections available for that so much more that you never knew in the first place. And then I'll add this as well. Just last week, I did a presentation to some housing providers. And when it got to the topic of the Violence Against Women Act, there was a lot of great discussion, a lot of questions. And one of the things we talked about is landlords have a hard time, especially what Erica just mentioned, when you're just an individual landlord and maybe you own an investment property. And, being a property manager is not your full-time job. You just simply do it for some extra money on the side or something like that. A lot of times property managers are wonderful people and there's a human touch to it. And when you have someone who's experienced domestic violence, you want to have that human connection. But when you work for a property management corporation who has attorneys and they're always saying, you can only go so far with the assistance because we have to maintain that landlord-tenant relationship, a lot of people get stuck in the middle. And what we talked about last week was the landlord's job is to be the landlord, and that's to maintain the property and to receive rent and to make repairs. Their job isn't to be a therapist. It's not their job to help the tenant find resources for domestic violence, as much as they may want to. And I can tell you right now, in that room last week, a lot of housing providers were saying, I can't just say no. It's another human in need of help, and I want to reach out. And so, unfortunately, a lot of landlords and property managers, they're forced to draw lines that their heart tells them they don't want to. But because of the relationship of landlord-tenant, they're kind of forced to draw that line. And it kind of muddies up or it grays the relationship. So we get a lot of tenants calling us, saying, can you believe my landlord did this? Our response is always, it's hard to believe, but legally they didn't do anything wrong. They're just kind of, acknowledging their own boundaries. What my last point to that is, a lot of people who are facing crisis or who recently went through a domestic violence incident, they're driven by emotion. And so by being driven by emotion, you are, I don't want to say expecting, but you're really hoping that the response to your needs is going to be with a human touch. You might not get that from a property manager as much as they may want to. That's not where it's going to be coming from. And so it kind of creates more conflict. It creates more rough edges in that housing relationship. And so a lot of people reach out to us and will say things like, can you believe that? In a perfect world, no, I wouldn't believe it. But that's kind of how the law lies. So our role is to really help people understand it's an opportunity to take a deep breath and let's look at this from a legal perspective. Let's look at this from a resource perspective. Let's look at this from the perspective of what your relationship with your landlord should be versus what it might have accidentally become. So I think we do play a role in helping people kind of step back and realize this is what's in front of you.
And I will say Florida Legal is an amazing organization. Joe and Erica, thank you so much for the work that you do and the services that you provide. It just goes to show how important awareness and education is in speaking about housing, because like you said, there are so many things that people who are being discriminated against don't know. And then there's also things that even landlords don't know. So thank you so much for attending those outreaches, doing those trainings. Like, I appreciate it, and I'm sure the people who are there appreciate it as well. So the last question that I have for both of you today is for anyone who is listening, who is a survivor of violence and is having a hard time finding shelter. What resource and advice would you give to them?
I would certainly tell them if they are a survivor, always the first referral source I would give to someone is the 800-500-1119 number, which is the statewide domestic violence hotline number. That is the number that they should be able to speak to an advocate at any time and at least be pointed in the right direction with respect to, are you looking for support? Are you looking for an advocate? Are you looking for local resources in your county, your shelter? Are you trying to flee to another county and trying to see what might be available there? But that will also connect you to us if you are in need of just legal guidance. But I think that's usually the best point to start, simply because they should point you to the local resource in your county. And from there, hopefully there are more information available.
And yeah, exactly what Erica said. When you also reach out to homeless shelters or victim services, I've spoken to a lot of people that say, I don't want to go to a shelter. I always remind them that if you're not looking to spend the night in a shelter, they also have advocacy services. And I think a lot of people forget that part. A shelter is just one part of the shelter. The advocacy services is a huge part of it. Housing services, housing relocation services, even like employment-based services, like it's usually holistic services when you walk into one of those shelters. I think a lot of people have to get it out of their heads that just because you don't need a bed tonight doesn't mean you don't need those services.
Right. Well, Joe and Erica, thank you so much for taking the time to answer these questions and even be on this podcast. I have learned so much today. I don't know about anyone else who is listening, but this has shed so much light on the Florida housing crisis and how marginalized communities, they can face discriminatory practices when it comes to it. So thank you so much. I'm going to definitely do more research, because in the future, when I have to buy a house, who knows? You never know. So, Joe and Erica, thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thank you so much for having us.
The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free, confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. The views and opinions expressed by podcast participants are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. This podcast content is made available for informational and educational purposes, and the VSC does not make any representation or warranties with respect to the accuracy or completeness of the content. While we make every effort to ensure that the information we are sharing is accurate, we welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear, and you are not alone. Thank you so much for listening.